Welcome to History 1302. We're continuing on with our discussion of events that took place after the Second World War. And we're going into the decade of the 1960s. And your textbook discusses this as a decade of chaos. And again, I've mentioned this before in class, after World War I, 1302 really lends itself to talking about it decade by decade. So we've taken a look at the Roaring Twenties, we've taken a look at the Great Depression in the 1930s, we've taken a look at the decade of World War II, then we've taken a look at the 1950s, and that kind of ends with this continuing fear brought on by the Cold War, and now we're picking up with the Cold War, continuing that on, and we're going to start right off with the Bay of Pigs. I guess I need to go back and respell that. It's not Pay of Pigs, it's Bay of Pigs. Then we'll take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll take a look at several assassinations, including John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy's going to get assassinated. Martin Luther King will be assassinated. Malcolm X will be assassinated. We often forget about that. There's going to be one after another after another. Then we'll talk about the Johnson administration. We'll take a look at the Vietnam War, and we'll take a look at the Civil Rights Movement. And again, this is just a decade of chaos. What really characterizes the 1960s is a decade of chaos. So with that in mind, let's go on. And the first thing I want to discuss is kind of an overview. Throughout the 1950s, a pattern of foreign policy had emerged. And so in the next slide, I really want to take a look at this pattern of foreign policy. So with this overview in mind, let's go on to the next slide. All right, when we're talking about foreign policy, a pattern emerges. And what we're taking a look at here is something that the Soviet Union is basically doing the same thing at the same time. And the context, and I can't overemphasize this, is the Cold War. The idea, and we talked about this in the 1950s, is through the long telegram by George Kennan. He had encapsulated what the dictators had done in the 1930s by saying, they'll use the democratic process to get on top, then they'll deliver the perceived will of the people. Then they'll begin an era of expansion and challenging the Allies, and they'll just continue to use the next step. Somewhere in that mix is going to be some violence, and again, in the post-World War II era, George Kennan's pointing out that the Soviet Union has already done all of those steps. Now they're up to the last few steps, which is challenge the Allies and keep challenging them until the only outcome is war. Again, the big issue in the mix is the nuclear bomb. Everybody's got the bomb. Even the Chinese have the bomb. The Soviets have the bomb. And again, we've been all these sides have been detonating these bombs left, right, and center. So everybody has this crazy thing. So if the Soviet Union or China continues to expand, they have to be challenged. They have to be stopped. Because nobody wants to take that next step and next step and next step until a war breaks out, because it's going to turn into a thermonuclear war very rapidly. It will escalate. So with that comes the domino theory, the idea being that if one country gets knocked off by the communists, either whether it's China or the Soviet Union, then the next country will get knocked off, and the next country will get knocked off, and the next country will get knocked off, until there's, there's nothing left but war. Now, this occurred, in other words, the fear was in Korea, and then we'll see especially this domino theory be articulated publicly by LBJ when we start talking about Vietnam. So what both nations are doing, this is to say the Soviet Union, China to some degree, though it's very hard to evaluate because we have no documents, no historical documents coming out of China, but the United States is certainly doing that. We evaluate third world nations for their loyalty, in this case to the United States or to democratic governments. And so we're taking a look at, for example, Iran. We were taking a look at that. At the time it was a democratic nation, and the president's guy was a guy named Mossadegh. And Mossadegh kept on asking the United States for help, and kept asking for help. And for a variety of reasons, we kept denying him help. So Mossadegh in Iran wanted to modernize. He wanted to make Persia from a colonial pawn into a modern state. And they located big oil reserves, and Mossadegh wanted to expand. He wanted to modernize. But we basically kept saying no or ignoring him. Well, Mossadegh turned then to the Soviet Union, which immediately that meant that he was our adversary. So we removed Mossadegh and we put in the Shah of Iran, which was catastrophic. So we're doing that all the time. We're evaluating these third world nations for their loyalty to the United States. Then if they are unfriendly, we will overthrow them. We will install our own dictators, it turns out. If they're a good dictator or a bad dictator, it's a separate issue, as long as they are loyal to the United States. And again, in the Middle East, a good example of that is Saddam Hussein. We put Saddam Hussein into charge. We put the Shah of Iran in charge. We put, later on we'll talk about Vietnam, we put Thieu and Key. We put all those guys in charge. And they were essentially dictators. In other words, they didn't really control the will of the people. They weren't doing what the will of the people demanded of them as leaders in their own nations. But they were really, really loyal to the United States, so we kept them there. Now, to be clear, the communists were doing the same thing. Erich Honecker, they put him in East Germany, and he was super loyal to the Soviet Union, and so he stayed. The Polish regime, no different. The Chinese did that in North Korea. They put Kim in charge there, and he was a brutal, brutal dictator, and his offspring, his ancestors, are in charge in North Korea even today. So everybody's doing the same thing. So we have these examples: South Vietnam, Diem, Thieu, and Key. In Cuba, we're going to try and kill Castro several times. As it turns out, I'm recording this in 2014. We're still just waiting for Castro to go ahead and die, and we want this guy dead. In Iran, we put Mossadegh out, and then we put the Shah in. In Honduras, we did this again and again and again. In Panama, El Salvador, Iraq, we did all these things, okay? As long as this brutal dictator, wherever it was we were installing them, were loyal to us and crushing the communists, we were happy with that, okay? So this is a pattern of foreign policy that just emerges, and I can't overemphasize this. The Russians were doing the same thing, and the Chinese were doing the same thing. So this is kind of the harsh reality for all these third world countries as we're going through the 1960s. It will negatively affect Africa as well. There's a lot of these countries that are just going to sink into just abysmal chaos, and really Africa, especially below the equator, equatorial Africa and sub-equatorial Africa has never emerged. You still just have chaos down there. And it's because in the 1960s, the United States and Russia were just kind of dividing it all up and trying to find people that we can advocate, and just pouring in weapons. You could buy, for a long time in equatorial and sub-equatorial Africa, you could buy a brand new AK-47 for like $50. And then, because the Soviet Union was just pouring them in, trying to destabilize the area, see if they could get a strong man that they could back, and then start, turning the nation to communism. It didn't work out, but it's horrible. In other words, the after effects of this are still being, there's a lot of repercussions even today. So with this pattern in mind, let's go in and start talking. We'll dig into the 1960s then, and we need to start with the Kennedy administration. So let's move on to the next slide and take a look at the Kennedy administration. Okay, what we're talking about now is the Kennedy administration. Now, a little bit of background on John F. Kennedy. He's obviously coming out of the Kennedy family, and now his father was Joe Kennedy, and Joseph Kennedy, especially during the 1920s and 1930s, struggled very hard to get to the top. In other words, he was a very, very ambitious man. He wanted to rise above these poor, basically Irish ancestry, and really wanted to be part of this big dynasty. He wanted to be an important part of American history. And so during the 1920s, I have to say, the Kennedy family, at least at one point and in part, they made a lot of money during Prohibition running alcohol. But then as soon as they made a certain amount of money, got ahead a little bit, Joe Kennedy started switching to politics as a way to advance. And he went into state politics, and then later on he went into national politics. And in effect, he sort of initiated a political machine, and it really has to do with the Irish vote. But, it's not overt, it's really rather subtle. But he made sure that he got in with the FDR administration. Later on, he'll be the ambassador to England. And so he was very, very successful. Joe Kennedy, that is to say John F. Kennedy's father, he was very, very successful in his political ambitions. So in the 20s and 30s, this is the beginning of the Kennedy family and this big political dynasty. Now, John F. Kennedy's older brother was Joseph Kennedy Jr., and all these guys are going to be important in the Second World War, but really on a low level. And so Joe Kennedy, in other words, to put some meat on those bones, to make that clear, Joseph Jr. Was in the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, and he was always volunteering for these really, really dangerous missions. And so one of the programs that he got himself involved in was really, really super dangerous. And the idea was to make these bombers into basically giant flying bombs. And the whole idea was to load the aircraft full of all sorts of explosives and then fly it up to an altitude and then set all sorts of remote control devices and turn those on so they can be radio controlled from another aircraft. And then the pilot would then bail out. And then the radio controlling aircraft would fly the bomb-loaded aircraft off to his target. Well, Joe Kennedy Jr. was getting ready to bail out, so he set all the controls, and evidently it was wired wrong. And when he turned on one of the switches, it detonated all the bombs. So he was just basically obliterated on this really difficult, really top-secret mission. So he gave his life for his country. And John F. Kennedy, he was off in the Pacific, very famously, in really some risky operations himself. He was on a very small sort of patrol torpedo boat, and they're basically made out of plywood, and they have these torpedoes on them. Well, the idea is you take this motorboat, and you charge at some big giant enemy ship, and then at the last minute you launch these torpedoes at this enemy ship, and then your boat, this small torpedo boat, shears away, and you try, duck and dodge all the enemy fire until the torpedo that you launch hits this big giant enemy ship and presumably blows it up. Well, that's what John Kennedy did during the war. And they were out on patrol one night, very famously, and out of nowhere, in the middle of the night, a Japanese ship came along and hit their vessel and cut it in two. And John Kennedy, pulled the rest of the guys together and got them on some, small abandoned South Seas island. And then he swam from island to island to island getting help. And, kind of left these guys there and said, stay where you're at and I'll go for help and I'll bring back some help. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, he was back with help. So he had to swim, through shark-infested water to do this really heroic act. So he is personally very much a war hero. During the 1950s, he's the senator from Massachusetts. He challenged the Republican vice president for the 1960 election, and the Republican vice president for the 1960 election was Eisenhower's vice president, and that was Richard Milhous Nixon. And very famously, they had the first televised debates. Well, again, this is all very famous. Kennedy, he went out and consulted with television people. And he said, okay, how do I appear on television and make the best impression? And they said, well, you got to have makeup, and you got to have the hair done, and you got to have just exactly this, that, and the other. And here's what you can expect when, these really harsh lights come on. So he got prepared. Well, Nixon, by contrast, he was trying to be a manly man, and so he didn't really prepare. And so when the lights came on and the television was going, Nixon was all sweaty, and he was literally just melting with sweat. And Kennedy was cool, calm, and collected, and he had this makeup on, and that kind of, dealt with it. He prepared for it by talking to the experts. And Nixon did not do that. So sure enough, it made Nixon look like he was hiding something or lying or nervous. But by contrast, here was Kennedy with this full head of hair and really, really a handsome guy. And so as it turns out, everybody voted for him. He just looked confident, and quite frankly, women fell in love with him on TV. So there's this certain audience that he was really able to appeal to. So that was the 1960 election. He's in from 1961, and then sadly he'll be assassinated in 1963. Now let's take a look at his policies, his domestic policy. Now, the idea here, as a Democrat, is to kind of revive these populist policies that Theodore Roosevelt and FDR had really pioneered. Throughout the 1950s, Kennedy noted that the nation as a whole really did prosper, and we've already talked about that. Everybody was, buying cars and consumer goods, and the Marshall Plan was injecting billions of dollars into the economy, and so the economy had really prospered. However, the Democrats noted that there were still areas of extreme poverty. Let's say Nevada, Utah, western Colorado, the Appalachians, parts of New Mexico and Arizona. There were just these areas that had just nothing but just extreme poverty. In other words, they had been left behind in this economic boom of the 1950s. So the idea then was to find these areas of poverty and put a bunch of government programs in there, construction programs. Go into Appalachia and put in a road system, or put in a dam system, or put in some sort of electrification, and bring jobs to the people of the Blue Ridge Mountains sort of thing. But to identify these last layer areas of poverty and pour money into it, make all sorts of programs in there, especially construction programs, so that people would have work. He also wants to expand civil rights. In other words, we kind of talked about this before, Truman had signaled to the African American population when he desegregated the military that the Democrats were really the party of African Americans. And Kennedy kind of reached out again, and he began to recognize that African Americans in the South were just being treated really, really, really badly. Now, we will talk in just a little while about some of these big Supreme Court cases, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, among others. And we're going to see that even after Brown v. Board, African Americans in the South were really being isolated. They were still being segregated. You still had this separate but equal. And JFK wants to end all that. So he continues to reach out to the African American population, and that's going to be really important throughout the 1960s. And again, I'll have a couple of presentations. There are several pages on here that deal with nothing but civil rights. So we'll talk about that later on. He also wants to expand the technological lead in the world. Now, he did that. He introduced that idea in his inaugural speech. He said, listen, first off, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And then he went on to talk about during this decade, and so here we were in 1960, during this decade, we want to successfully put a man on the moon and successfully, safely return them to Earth. So he challenged the American people. He said, listen, here is a task that I want done. And I'm going to, get all of our technology and all of our science. I'm going to pour all this money into technology, and we're going to get that done. And that really did appeal to the people of the United States of America, give everybody a clearly identifiable task, and really play upon people's patriotism to get that task accomplished. And sure enough, obviously he didn't live to see it, but in 1968, we sent, the Apollo 11 mission went to the moon and came back, and they did that. So that will work. He begins financial aid to students, not just the GI Bill, but he begins with these Pell Grant programs. And so that's going to work. And so, in other words, he wants to raise education. And this is really the time frame when the idea of just getting out of high school and then going into a career for the rest of your life based on your high school education, that would be enough. This is the beginning of the end of that. By 1970, 1975, you had to have a college education if you were going to move forward. But the way Kennedy begins to end, or begins an era of basically having a college education, it's really the 1960s, by making sure that there's a lot of money available for students. Okay, so he's really the beginning of that. For those of you who are listening to this, you need a vote of thanks to the Kennedy administration for beginning that. Domestically, he also wants to export ideological democracy, and the big task here, and this is really the brainchild of a guy named Sergeant Shriver. Sergeant Shriver. His rank was not sergeant. His name was Sergeant. Now, Sergeant Shriver was Kennedy's brother-in-law, and he was really high up in the administration. He was a Kennedy advisor. And Sergeant Shriver had this brainstorm. He said, listen, what we need to do is take some of these kids that are coming out of college and then put them in third world countries on a voluntary basis and help them to, build simple infrastructure in these third world countries. But that's not what they were really there for. And so, in other words, let me kind of explain it this way. Imagine if you're a college student, you just got out of college, and you're 23, 24, 25 years old. You don't really have a job yet or anything like that. So Sergeant Trevor would say, listen, if you're going to join the Peace Corps, we'll get rid of any of your college debt, or we'll give you a little bit of money, or this, that, or the other. And then you go off to Africa, you go to South America, you go to Peru or Bolivia, you go to Uganda, someplace like that. And you go there and you build a water well, or you build a school, or you build a small hospital or a community center out there for the people. And that's what you're there to do. But the idea, and this was really the genius of Sergeant Shriver, is that at night, in the afternoons or evenings, you as a college student in America, you're going to sit around and talk to the local natives, and they're going to talk to you. And the stories that are going to come out is, this is what America's all about. Yeah, we have this thing called television, and we have this cool deal called a radio, and we have these beautiful big giant cars with these huge highways, and you can go to get a great education. And then, again, Sergeant Shriver knew this is what would happen. He was thinking about the human dynamic. He knew that the local people would say, well, you've got all this wonderful stuff, and you come from this, basically this utopia, and you got this tremendous education. What on earth are you doing here in the boondocks in the middle of nowhere, swatting mosquitoes over a campfire, on the far side of the world? And of course the student would say, well, I've had all this wonderful life. I want to give something back to the community. Now think how that would be absorbed by some person in Africa or some person in South America. They would think, what a wonderful place America is, what wonderful people these Americans are. And that lasting impression would last a long, long time. And so, in other words, this worked perfectly. Even today, if you go to Pakistan, and many a newspaper reporter or media reporter has done this, you go to Pakistan to report on some story, and you talk to the cab drivers, you can talk to the local people, and what do you want to do, and where do you want to go when you grow up? That sort of thing. And so many people will say, I want to go to America. I've heard that America is this wonderful place. And it's because, I'm telling you right now, it's because these kids in the 60s and 70s were going all over planet Earth as basically unofficial goodwill ambassadors. And so the Peace Corps worked way, way beyond anybody's wildest imaginations. It really was it was a brainstorm, it was a heck of a brainstorm, and a great program, and it really did work. Now in the 70s it starts to get underfunded, but there's still a Peace Corps today, and it's really an amazing deal, okay? Even when I was a young man, before I joined the military, there were commercials everywhere, and it would say on there, join the Peace Corps, it's the best 2 years of your life, or something like that. And they would give you a little bit of training, and they would say, okay, where do you want to go? Okay, Uganda or Peru or Bolivia, and they would teach you the local language and some of the local customs, kind of brief you, and then give you tasks to do once you were there. And they would give you a little stipend, and they would fix you all up, and it was really a great idea. And it worked far beyond anybody's wildest imagination. Tremendously successful program. Now that's all domestic. As I've pointed out before, after World War II we have to talk about foreign policy on every president. We had never talked about that previously. In other words, in 1302 we did not talk about Grant. We didn't talk about Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy really, or McKinley's foreign policy. We didn't really talk about Hoover or Coolidge's foreign policy. But after World War II, everybody has a foreign policy. Now the foreign policy here is going to be dominated by the Cold War. And we're going to start out with the Bay of Pigs, which is the next couple of slides. Then we'll transition to the Cuban Missile Crisis because they are connected. They're closely connected. So one of these events is going to follow the other. Then we'll expand, and we're going to talk about efforts in Southeast Asia and this effort to stop the domino effect in Southeast Asia. But then Kennedy's going to be assassinated, as it turns out. And so these projects are going to come to an abrupt end, and then we'll talk about them again under LBJ, especially the Vietnam War. That's going to dominate LBJ's administration. Okay, So with that in mind, let's go in then and talk about the Bay of Pigs, and it's going to turn out to be a tremendous fiasco. With that in mind, let's go on to the next slide, which is about the Bay of Pigs. Okay, now what we're going to do now is talk about the Bay of Pigs, which was a fiasco, and it was just a disaster for the Kennedy administration. It's also known as the Baía de Coquinos, Bay of Pigs, and the origins of this lie in the Eisenhower administration. So at the very end of the Eisenhower administration, Fidel Castro overthrew the government in Cuba. So if you'll recall, I gave you guys a pattern of foreign policy that had emerged. To be clear, in Cuba, in the 1950s, 1930s, 40s, and 50s, there'd been a series of brutal dictators that we back in the United States. And so in the 50s especially, there'd been a brutal dictator, and he was taking all of this money and laundering it from gangsters in America. And there was a series of big giant hotels and casinos in Havana and in different places in Cuba. And, you know, only the Americanos, only the tourists could go to these places. So the basic Cuban population, their role was to just be servants and go be taxi drivers and go be, you know, cooks and cleaners for all these rich Americanos that were coming down to Cuba and having a good time and then laundering all their money and engaging in prostitution and doing all this stuff. So it was a huge gulf between the very rich and the very poor in Cuba. And the governor of Cuba at the time was a guy named Batista, and he was basically an American plant, really. He was just an American agent. And he was letting these big gangsters just basically get away with anything. So Fidel Castro didn't really like that sort of thing, and so he began to get, you know, he was basically a rebel, and he was just a nobody. He was just a rebel living out there in the jungles. But he made a connection with all the farmers. Now, what I'm about to say is like really, I don't know, iconoclastic when we talk about American history. Everybody's like really bad on Castro. And as time went on, he did become a brutal, repressive dictator. He did. But in those early days, I want to be clear, he was about the Cuban people. He was not a communist. He was a nationalist, and that's a separate thing. And again, we're going to run into this again and again and again. So during the 50s, the late 1950s, Castro got a lot more support from the farmers, and he promised them all sorts of land reforms, which they were going to get. It was just not going to be the way they thought. And so he was able to overthrow Batista. And when he overthrew Batista, he nationalized all the big hotels and all the big automobile dealerships and all the big businesses that were being run by Americans, but really exploitative of the local population. Well, this was right at the very end of the Eisenhower administration. So the military came up with a plan to overthrow Castro. Now, I want to be clear on something. Castro approached Eisenhower in those early days, right after he'd thrown out Batista. And he approached Eisenhower and said, listen, we need help to rebuild the nation. And he said to Eisenhower, basically, I'm a nationalist. I'm not a communist. But then Eisenhower, you know, he kind of had to listen to the American people, and in this case, big businessmen. The Ford Motor Company had big holdings down there. The Hilton hotel chain had big holdings in Cuba. The big sugar companies, you know, basically Cuba was a big banana republic, but the big sugar companies had massive holdings in Cuba, and that's why the Cubans were really upset. All the land was being owned by all these big American companies, and the farmers were just basically tenant farmers in their own country. They had nothing. So the land got nationalized by Castro, and he was redistributing the land to the farmers, which they really did like. But Eisenhower had to listen to the big business guys, and he said no to Castro. Now listen to me carefully on this, because that's a big step. Castro knew that he needed political backing from somebody. In other words, if you're not going to be pro-American and have American backing, which is what Castro wanted in those early days, you had to look for somebody else for political cover. And the only other person they could look to was Soviet Russia under Khrushchev. So he appealed to Khrushchev, and he said, listen, I need political support, I need money, I need backing, I need a place, I need an outlet for products in Cuba. More importantly, I just need protection from these Americans who are going to want to take the island back over and give the land and the money and the wealth back to these Americanos. And so Castro did not want to return to all the corruption of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. He didn't want that. And neither did anybody else in Cuba. Well, Khrushchev said yes to Castro, but there was a string attached, and it was a very difficult one. Khrushchev said to Castro, okay, I'll back you up and I'll do everything you want militarily and help you guys out and give you political cover, but you've got to switch to some sort of Soviet brand communism. Well, immediately that runs into this policy of containment and the domino theory. The fear in America was that if Cuba fell to the Russians, then Puerto Rico would fall, and then some of the other Caribbean islands would fall, and then part of South America would fall, and then Central America would fall, and then, the next thing you know, we got Russians right on our front doorstep. And remember now, Cuba is only 70 miles away from Florida, so this was literally right in our back door. Well, with that in mind, then, the military approached Eisenhower and said, listen, we kind of got this plan to get a bunch of these Cuban nationalists to go back down there, make a secret landing in the Bay of Pigs, go out and talk to the farmers, hide out in the jungles, hide out in the bush, and get the farmers riled up against Castro, and then have a counter-revolution. And then everything will be great. Well, just as that plan was really kind of getting started, there was an election. And Eisenhower was not running for re-election. He couldn't. He was at the end of his second term. But the assumption was that Nixon was going to win. And then Nixon lost, as we've just talked about. So kind of at the last minute, as Eisenhower was walking out the door, almost literally, then he kind of sat Kennedy down and kind of briefed him on this. And Kennedy was like, okay, well you're the victor of Europe. You'd defeated Europe. What do you think about the plan? And Eisenhower's, well, just kind of listen to your generals and go with what they say. So then the very next thing in other words, the day Kennedy came into office, this event was sitting on his desk. And he brought his generals in, and later he very bitterly criticized them because he asked them, okay, what do you guys think about this plan? Well, of course, it was the plan that they'd come up with. And so he said plainly, here were all these generals with all these medals on their chests, and they just sat there and nodded when the plan was presented, and nobody had a countervailing point of view. So all the generals were agreeing with the plan, which was crazy. It was just a concocted plan. So Kennedy said, well, because I have the support of all the generals, and this thing came up, really before my administration started, he went with it. And the plan was nuts. So let's get on to the verbiage that's actually on the slide then. So the idea was these U.S. CIA-trained Cuban exiles are going to invade Cuba, the island of Cuba. And they would go in at night under cover of darkness, and it would be this surprise invasion, and there would be this, this kind of insertion of these guys. They would go up into the jungles and into the highlands and into the mountains and stay there for a while and get resupplied by the Americans, and then start the farmers on a counter-revolution. Basically promise them anything, as long as they'll overthrow Castro. Then it happened, and so Kennedy agreed with all this, and then it happened. Well, it was a badly thought-up plan. In other words, nobody had thought to ascertain whether the farmers in Cuba would support a counter-overthrow, a counterattack, a counter-revolution. And of course they would not have, because they got all the land back. In other words, Castro gave them all the land back. So they had exactly no incentive for a counter-revolution, none. In other words, they knew what was going to happen. The Americans would put all the dictators back in control, all the corruption back in control. So these guys showed up. It was late one night. They were badly trained. There was a parachute drop that landed in the wrong place. There was these guys running around on the beach with flashlights on, trying to figure out what was going on. They were all lost. One of the locals saw these lights and saw this excitement going on. He called the local police, who went out to investigate, and here were all these guys lost, and they all had weapons. And they called Fidel Castro, and Castro swung into action. Today we think of him as this ancient old guy with all these intestinal problems and this crazy beard. But at the time he was really young and dynamic, and he was really well motivated. So he swung into action, literally, and got all of these guys in control and called out the militia, and they started rounding up these ill-organized, poorly trained CIA agents. So then, and I'm at the place where it says Kennedy pulls the plug, then Kennedy was faced with a decision. And the military guys came to him and the CIA came to him and said, listen, you've got one of two choices. Either we go in with a full-scale CIA, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine operation and do a D-Day style invasion and do this the hard way, or you got to pull the plug. You only have two choices. We can't go on like it is. Well, Kennedy then kind of came to the realization that he was being railroaded basically into World War III. Because remember, the Russians were watching. And so if he invaded Cuba, the Russians would retaliate. God knows what they were really going to do. And then, you know, it would escalate into basically global thermonuclear exchange. So Kennedy was like, listen, I'd been assured that all these farmers would come out and greet the counter-invasion, and none of that has happened. So he felt railroaded and betrayed by the military and tricked, and so he did pull the plug. He did the right thing, as it turns out. And again, Castro reacted swiftly and crushed the effort. So without any further support, air support or Air Force support or Navy support or Navy gunfire, you know, nothing could happen. And so Khrushchev had made a series of telephone calls and said to, Cuba, said to Castro back and forth, yeah, we'll give you all the support you need. We'll back you right up to the hilt. And so Kennedy pulls back and pulls the plug on this. Now, the unexpected, on analysis here, the unexpected outcome of this is that Khrushchev feels that Kennedy is weak. Khrushchev really strongly gets the impression that Kennedy is weak and can be pushed around. He's not a Republican, he's a Democrat, and the Russians feel that the Democratic Party is not really the military party, and they can be pushed around. In other words, he's kind of the opposite of Eisenhower. Eisenhower could not be bluffed, he couldn't be pushed around. Now, a side note on this before we go to the next slide, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bear in mind now, Khrushchev goes back to the Second World War. He'd been very active in the Second World War. He'd been very active at Stalingrad. So he was, he was an experienced military man. So with the Bay of Pigs in mind, let's go on to the very next step, which is going to lead directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's go on to the next slide then and find out the origins of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, now the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be a direct outgrowth of the Bay of Pigs. So Castro is in charge in Cuba, and he has had to ally himself with Nikita Khrushchev, who is then the premier of the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev feels that Kennedy is weak because of the Bay of Pigs thing. So one of the strings attached to Castro being allied with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union was that Castro had to agree with some of the things that the Russians wanted to do. And the Russians wanted to put ICBMs on Cuba. So Castro had to agree with that, and he did. Well, we kind of got wind of this, and so we started making U-2 spy missions, U-2 overflights, aircraft overflights over Cuba. And we started seeing all these anti-aircraft missile batteries, which is what's going on down in the lower right, that kind of star shape. Those are anti-aircraft missile batteries. And then going kind of clockwise, those long, narrow tents and those long, narrow canvas-covered structures, those are ballistic missiles that are like lying down, and they're underneath a canvas cover. And then in the upper left, you can see more of those little stick-looking things. Those are those U-2 overflights, and those are a bunch of, nuclear bombs sitting on missiles that are laying down. In other words, they haven't been installed yet. They hadn't been set up yet. Now, the problem was that instead of these being what they called ICBMs, now an ICBM is an intercontinental ballistic missile. And those things usually took about a half an hour or 45 minutes. Once they were launched in the Soviet Union, it took about a half an hour and 45 minutes for them to actually arrive in America. And the way we had things set up, we could detect those We could detect those missiles being launched, and we could detect them, in flight, and we could detect them coming in. And that half an hour, 45 minutes, that gave us time to be able to alert our guys and tell them to shoot their missiles, and we could blow up the Soviet Union. But the missiles that they put on Cuba, and that's what's being indicated there on that kind of map there on the upper right, are what's called intermediate range ballistic missiles or medium range ballistic missiles. Those two kind of circles there. Well, the problem with those, especially the medium range ballistic missiles, was that they would arrive in Washington, D.C. without notice. In other words, they get shot off, and then we would hardly be able to detect those and get the message that they'd shot a missile, and these crazy things would arrive in Washington, D.C. and kill everybody. The idea being that we would not be able to respond to a Soviet missile launch, and that put us at a big disadvantage. They could blow us up, and then presumably we would never be able to blow them up. And then the intermediate ballistic missiles, they can be launched from Cuba as well, and as you can see, they would land in our missile bases in America. So they would blow up our missile bases before we would even be able to launch the missiles, while the missiles were still in the silos. And that would disrupt our ability to respond to a nuclear attack. So if there were any kind of, if one of these third world countries got into a fight and, it began to escalate, the Russians would have a huge advantage. More about that in a minute. But this really scared the crap out of our people. Now, we knew the missiles were there, but our intelligence was that the warheads, the actual nuclear devices, had not arrived yet. They were on ships headed from the Soviet Union to Cuba. So once Kennedy found that out, he began to warn the Soviet Union that if the nuclear warheads arrived, we were going to do something about that. We were going to stop those ships from arriving in Cuba so they could load the missile warheads onto the missiles, load the nuclear devices onto the missiles. We were going to stop that from happening. And so this thing begins to spin out of control, like in a big, big way. So let's go on to the next slide and take a look at kind of what happens next, okay? Because this thing is really starting to get out of hand. Okay, so here we are. Now we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now this is the actual crisis as it unfolded, and it's all in October 1962. And there's several books out about this, and they're all about these 13 days in October, and that's one of the big books out there, 13 Days in October. Well, so there we have it. In the previous slide, I kind of mentioned this. The USSR deploys these medium-range ballistic missiles, and they're only down on Florida, which is only south of Florida, there on Cuba, only 60 miles away. We knew that they were there. Our intelligence had suggested that the actual warheads were on ships heading to Cuba. What we did not know was that some of the warheads were actually already there. And even to this day, there is actually some debate about this. McNamara, years later, went to talk to Castro about this, and Castro revealed to him that he knew that the missiles were there, and that if the United States had actually attacked, the plan was, on Khrushchev's side, Khrushchev was going to go ahead and use the missiles. And Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, asked Castro directly, were you going to okay with that? Were you going to prove it? And did you know the missiles were there? And did you know the nuclear warheads were there? And Castro admitted to it all. He said, yes, I knew the missiles were there. I knew some of them actually had their warheads on it. And I knew Khrushchev would use them if he felt like he had to. And I approved that. Castro revealed that he had already approved that. And that was going to lead to the total, complete annihilation of Cuba and everybody on it. But Castro said he was going to go through with it. So we were really, really close to literally mutually assured destruction, which we've talked about before. We were minutes away from that. At one point, the USSR threatens war. Khrushchev, again, he'd been in the Second World War, and this was really making him nervous. But he was very bombastic, and he was very how shall I say this, very aggressive in his foreign policy. And at one point he had said publicly, my finger is hovering over the button. And that is to say, he was ready to push the button to start the war. So Kennedy confronted Khrushchev and said, listen, if these missile warheads land, we will feel like we have no choice but to go ahead and go through with this thing. And we're going to sink the ships at sea if they keep on. And we're going to blockade Cuba. And if you break the blockade, we're going to do this thing. And at one point, to give you guys a real clear assessment of how close this was, Kennedy had alerted all of the media outlets, which is ABC, CBS, NBC, and I guess PBS at the time. So those are the only 4 people that had TV stations out there. And Kennedy had alerted them and said, listen, set aside some airtime for me on one of these nights in October. And he said, and everybody assumed, and he kind of hinted at this, Kennedy did, everybody assumed that he was going to announce that thermonuclear war had been started. And basically for everybody to get in their bunkers. We were just that close. And so everybody was literally just shaking in their boots. At about that time, the teletype machine went on, and it was a message from Khrushchev, and Kennedy had sent messages back and forth, basically on this kind of, this red telephone sort of thing, which was actually a teletype machine back in those days. And one message came through saying, listen, maybe we can do something about this. And then a few minutes later, another message came through, and McNamara talked about how that was clearly a message from a drunkard, saying, we're going to blow each other up. So Kennedy sat down with these people, and one of them said, listen, respond to the first message and ignore the second message, because Khrushchev is looking for a way out. So you just got to give him, I think it was Harriman, who had been the Undersecretary of State to the Soviet Union for a while, and Harriman had said, listen, talk to Khrushchev, make a deal. Find a way out of this thing. Let's negotiate. Khrushchev does not want to actually do this. He's just in a tight spot at home. So you got to give Khrushchev a deal. So we did. Kennedy responded to the first message and ignored the second message, was the right call. And again, it took a lot of guts for, I think his name was Averell Harriman. I could be wrong on this, but I'll check on it. But I'm pretty sure it's Averell Harriman, who had been in the Soviet Union, and he at one of these meetings, literally with nuclear warfare minutes away, Harriman said, no, listen, I know Khrushchev, and he's just looking for a way out. He's backed himself into a corner by shooting off his mouth, and he needs something. So give him a little something, and let's defuse this. Well, that took a lot of guts. So to make a long story short, Kennedy got on the teletype, and he basically said, listen, you can get these missiles out of Cuba. Now listen to me carefully as I outline this. Kennedy said, listen, the USSR, the Soviet Union, has to get their missiles out of Cuba very, very publicly, where we can see it and everybody knows. And so Kennedy comes out looking like the hero, and he makes it look like Khrushchev had to back down. But then Kennedy said very secretly, we will get similar missiles that we have, we will get them out of Turkey, which was on the Soviet border. We'll take our missiles out of Turkey really, really quietly. And nobody will know that. Nobody even knows the missiles are actually there. So the United States will get their missiles out of Turkey very privately, very quietly, while the Soviet Union gets their missiles out of Cuba very publicly. And that'll kind of, Kennedy will have something to crow about. Well, by the way, in the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union controls the news systems, and nobody trusts the Soviet Union's news media outlets anyway, Khrushchev would be able to say, listen, I got the U.S. to take their missiles out of Turkey. Well, nobody was going to listen to that. So it made Kennedy look really good and made Khrushchev look kind of bad, but under any circumstances, we avoided global thermonuclear warfare, which I have there in big, giant red letters. So literally, everybody took a big, giant breath of, clean, fresh air, and, presumably went home and changed their underwear, because they were really, really, genuinely, honestly, truly close to pushing the buttons and killing all life on planet Earth. The cockroaches would have died. Everybody would have died. So this was very, very nerve-wracking. Now, again, let me kind of draw your attention to the cartoon up there. That says it all. Essentially, nuclear war was this gigantic beast, and as it turns out, Kennedy and Khrushchev together had to work together to keep this thing under some sort of control. Cooler heads had to prevail. There had to be some species of sanity. Now, we'd come close a couple of times since in actually getting into war, but nothing like October 1962. Nothing as close as that. That was like really, really, really genuinely, we were right on the edge of it. And I mean right on the edge of the end for everybody. So with that shockingly scary thought in mind, let's go on from this really something of a success on the part of Kennedy. Let's go on to the Kennedy assassination, because we just got to move on with class. We just have to get on with it. So let's go on to the Kennedy assassination, and then we'll go on and get LBJ into office. Okay, on this slide I want to talk about the Kennedy assassination, and let me start by saying that there are a great many conspiracy theories out there about the Kennedy administration. Let me address that up front, and then we'll kind of go through the basic facts. I'm not going to dig deep into this. There's so much material out there on the Kennedy assassination, it's just insane. But the conspiracy theories behind the assassination are now part of history. In other words, the event, the facts behind the event, and the event itself, they're one thing. But then the conspiracy theories, which begin really almost as soon as the assassination actually took place, the conspiracy theories begin immediately, and they too are now part of history. Now, my position is that Lee Harvey Oswald, working all by himself, assassinated JFK. He shot him in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, and on that date, November 22nd, 1963. That's my position, so let's go over the facts. Now, the background of this was that Kennedy was getting ready for re-election. Part of the reason why he was there in 1963 was he was on a re-election tour. And the vice president was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson had said, listen, with this Cuban Missile Crisis business, with this continuing business with civil rights, with the escalation of the Vietnam War, Kennedy's administration was really unpopular in the South. And Lyndon Baines Johnson said, we at least got to carry Texas. He didn't feel like they were going to carry much of the South. The Dixiecrats were down there and they were going mad. Okay, but he said, we at least got to carry Texas. So he invited Kennedy to Dallas to have, basically, show up, bring a little bit of the gloss and the glamour of the Kennedy administration, come down there with Jackie Kennedy and, have a good time, put on a cowboy hat, eat a little bit of barbecue, and make a few friends. And then that way, maybe, working together, they'd be able to carry Texas. Because they needed those electoral college votes. But it would just be embarrassing to the administration for the VP, LBJ, to not even carry their own state. Kennedy, of course, agreed with this, and so he flew down to Dallas. In other words, there's nothing strange about the reason why he was in Dallas in the first place. Now, obviously, because this is a re-election campaign, it's well advertised, everybody knew about it. Which leads us to Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, just a very few words on Lee Harvey Oswald. Again, there's a lot of information out there and a lot of misinformation about this. Lee Harvey Oswald had been a misfit most of his life. Evidently had a very difficult upbringing. There was a lot of antagonism between himself and his parents. He was a misfit, and he joined the military, as many people do. He went into the Marine Corps. He seemed to be naturally a good shot, and the Marines, they did not turn him into a sniper. They did not. But the Marines do insist on good marksmanship, and he just seemed to be naturally a good shot. He was a sort of a radar technician in the Marine Corps, and after a few years, he was kind of disillusioned with that, bored with it, and he mustered out. He did his time and he left. Well, again, back in America, he was a misfit. He didn't fit in anywhere. He just had that sort of really antagonistic personality. he became focused in on what was going on in Cuba. He felt that the United States was on the wrong side in Cuba. He decided that he was going to grow up to be a communist at a time when that was extremely unpopular. But again, this is just kind of part of his personality, this sort of antagonistic, this sort of contrary personality. Very famously, he went to Mexico, and from there he went to Cuba, and then he decided he was going to defect to the Soviet Union. So he did. And he tried to tell the Soviet people that he had all kinds of secrets. He did not. He met and married his wife, Marina. She is Russian, and then became disillusioned with what's going on in the Soviet Union. He lived in Moscow for a couple of years. So he went back to Mexico City and then came back to America. And again, he was really kind of shunned. Well, to make a long story short, he finally found work at the School Book Depository in Dallas, which is that sort of light-colored building, kind of background that you see in the lower left photograph. It's the 6-story building there. And so he was working there. He was fascinated with weapons. He got a gun through mail order, and it happened to have a sniper scope. And that's the weapon that you see in the upper right, that rifle there. It's a Mannlicher Carcano, very famously. So he heard that Kennedy was on his way. He snuck his rifle into, again, the School Book Depository up on the 6th floor. And you can see the shot from the window in that lower left. I took that photograph a few years ago. What I want you to do in terms of photographic analysis, though, is analyze how much the shrubbery and the trees have grown in the modern photograph versus how high they were in the photograph taken at the time of the assassination. And so you can see when a lot of people see that, they're like, well, he could never have made that shot because there's so much foliage in the way. Well, in the 1960s, that's not there. As you can see, the trees are much smaller and the foliage is a lot less. And so he had a much longer shot to actually get the shots off. Kennedy arrived at Dallas Love Field, which is just a few blocks from there. If you've been to Love Field, you know it's right in the downtown area. And that is to say, the road leading to the airport, to the passenger terminals, is just a few miles from that very spot. So he drove around with the top down of the car. He was waving at everybody. Everybody was there. It was a media event. He pulled into Dealey Plaza, and Lee Harvey Oswald got 3 shots off, and that was that. Kennedy was dead. Again, I'll indulge this just a few minutes. Lee Harvey Oswald got the shots off, and then he put the rifle down. He hid it in the rafters there in that room, and then he fled. And Kennedy got shot, so we'll follow his story for just a moment. They took him over to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, and he'd been shot in the upper right shoulder, through the right wrist, and then the other shot had gone through his head, and that obviously killed him. Both of them were probably fatal shots, but certainly the one that got him in the back of the head killed him. Well, one of the bullets went through to the other passenger in the car, who was Governor Connolly, John Connolly. Now, a few words about Connolly. He had been in World War II, and he was an avid hunter. So John Connolly, and this is part of the conspiracy theory, to the end of his life, his story never changed. And he always insisted that there were 2 shooters. He always insisted upon that. Probably what he heard was an echo of the first shot or the second shot. But he insisted that there were 2 shooters, and his story never changed. Well, that began to cloud the issue right away because everybody trusted his story. He's not an eyewitness, but an expert eyewitness. So, we'll follow Oswald's story then. He fled out of the building and walked around for a little while. He hid in a movie theater for a few hours until things began to calm down. Got out and left the movie theater. Well, he was walking towards his home a few blocks away, and a law enforcement stopped him, presumably to question him. In other words, somebody had called saying there's a suspicious character. And law enforcement went over there and got out to question Lee Harvey Oswald, who pulled out a .38 and shot the cop 3 or 4 times and killed him. Well, then Dallas PD had 2 problems on their hands immediately. They had the presidential assassination. They were scouring the area looking for that guy. And then they had a police shooting on their hands as well. And they didn't immediately connect them. But to make a long story short, they arrested Lee Harvey Oswald on the police shooting. Well, when they dragged him in, he said, I didn't have anything to do with the Kennedy assassination. No one had asked him that. Well, that brought all the suspicion, full circle. And so one thing led to another, which led to another, which led to another. In other words, they found out that he worked in the school book depository. They went there and found the gun. And so the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald simply began to add up. Well, the next day, and you can see from his mugshot there, and this was just a few minutes before he was actually shot himself, they were going to transport him. And they had him in the basement of the sheriff's department. They were going to take him up to the courthouse and arraign him for the assassination and for the murder of this police officer. And a guy named Jack Ruby, a local character who had some, how shall I put this, had some organized crime associations, managed to walk right into the basement of the police department. He was standing right there when Lee Harvey Oswald was brought out to be transported, and pulled out a .38, a snub-nosed .38, and shot Lee Harvey Oswald at point-blank range. Well, then this just clouds the issue. How did Jack Ruby get in there? How did he know to be there at that time? How did he get in there into the basement of the police building with a weapon? And then, sure enough, just a few weeks later, Jack Ruby's dead. So Lee Harvey Oswald is dead, Jack Ruby is dead, and there's this confused story about the assassination itself. So things just got out of hand in a hurry. From the very start, there were all this speculation about were the Russians involved, were the Cubans involved, was organized crime involved, and it just got out of hand from there. So if you look at the very bottom of the slide in small print, I have 4,410,000 hits in 0.12 seconds. And that's just a simple Google search. Just before I uploaded the slide onto the Brain Shark, I did that search, and that's the latest. If you go to Google and type in Kennedy assassination, you'll get 4 million hits. So this is a huge, huge event in American history, the Kennedy assassination. Well, again, our theory about the 1960s is a decade of chaos. So just put this into the context of a decade of chaos. Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, the assassination, decade of chaos. Well, on that note then, let's go to the very next slide, which is a very famous photograph of LBJ getting sworn in. And then we'll go to the very next slide after that, the LBJ administration. And then I have several large, very time-consuming slides, I have to say, that deal with civil rights and then the Vietnam War. All right, so on that note, let's go on to the LBJ administration. Okay, so this photograph that you're looking at here is LBJ on Air Force One being sworn in. And as it turns out, this is just hours after the assassination. They went over to the courthouse and they got a federal judge. There she is in the polka dot dress. And they basically, in effect, they essentially just kidnapped her out of her office and put her on Air Force One for an unscheduled flight to Washington, D.C. They loaded up the President Kennedy's coffin. It is literally, just below where the president, where LBJ and Jackie Kennedy are standing. There'd been, some really traumatic moments with loading his dead body up. In other words, everybody that you see here had to wait for a little while until Parkland pronounced the president dead, and then did sort of a preliminary autopsy, which lasted like 20 minutes. And again, this adds to the controversy because the persons performing the preliminary were not qualified to do an autopsy. Then they put him into a coffin, a hastily arranged coffin, and then as it turns out, the coffin would not fit through the doors to Air Force One. So they had to partially disassemble that, get it to the plane, and then get everybody moving. Now, the reason why there's such a hurry is that the feeling was that this could be a preliminary step to a thermonuclear attack from the Soviet Union or something crazy coming out of Cuba. Nobody knew. So they wanted to get LBJ sworn in like immediately so there would not be a loss in the chain of command in case this turned out to be something really, really big. Now, again, in the photograph there, you can see everybody. There's the woman in the white just next to LBJ on his right. That's Lady Bird Johnson. And then everybody else you can see is really dressed up. They were ready to go to this big dinner that night for the president, a big reception. And Jackie Onassis, you can see her there in that kind of a gray jacket there. And if you look closely, and this is really horrible, it's still splattered with blood and remains from her husband. So she's plainly in a state of shock. There's LBJ swearing in on the plane going back, and it's really a tremendous moment in American history. So with that traumatic beginning, let's go on to the LBJ administration. Johnson has sort of a mixed review from historians, even to this very day. Some point out that he's a man of deep personal feelings, that he was really out there to try and do the best thing for the people of the United States of America. His detractors, even to this day, talk about how he's a man of tremendous ambition, who is ready, willing, and able to just do anything for political power. Some people call him, kind of a rustic, and that he was, just not really, not entirely civilized, I guess you could say, kind of a backwoods man. Some people talk about how he's a highly intelligent individual. So our perception of LBJ is really, even to this day, it's not really, as one should say, objective. There's a lot of dichotomy in our interpretation of LBJ as the man. Certainly, he was very, really dynamically involved in politics. Politics as an event genuinely fascinated him. And he wanted to rise above his beginnings in West Texas. If you'll go kind of south, what would it be, southwest of Dallas by about an hour, you'll go into Johnson County. And he's from Johnson County. That's why it's called Johnson County. In other words, his family had lived there for generations. The family farm is still there, and if you go there, it's like a little 3-bedroom ranch in the middle of nowhere, right on the side of the road. So nothing special about his origins. He came up through Texas politics, very rough and tumble, went into Congress just before the Second World War, and there's some shenanigans with that. In other words, like all the other previous presidents, including JFK, as it turns out, and Nixon, he was the product of a political machine. And then as soon as he got elected, he had nothing but bad things to say about the political machine. So that kind of, the idea that he might have gotten into office as a result of some kind of shenanigan, that he never really shook that. And he was really sensitive about that sort of thing going forward. In World War II, very briefly, he was already in Congress. He quit Congress. He was really, even then, kind of too old to go into the military, but he felt that it was his patriotic duty to go into the Air Force, and he did. But he didn't stay long, because he would get into the Air Force and all we talk about is politics. So the Air Force gently suggested that he goes back to the Congress, and he did. His ideas, in other words, got him noticed by the Democratic Party. Sam Rayburn, for many years, was the Speaker of the House during that time, and Sam Rayburn brought him up in Congress. He came to the attention of the Democrats in the 1960 election as a way to reach out to the South. So that's how he became LBJ's running mate. Now, again, a lot has been written on the sort of disagreements between JFK and these very erudite, very elite Northeastern Democrats. JFK obviously was from Massachusetts. Sergeant Shriver was part of the Massachusetts political dynasty, and all these guys were really highly super educated, very kind of elite from the Northeast. And they had a very different view about this kind of rustic from Texas. But they needed each other politically. LBJ was perfectly willing to try and bring the South along to the Democratic cause, and he allied himself with these people that he didn't really connect with, these Northeasterners. So there was kind of there was a little bit of friction between him and the Kennedy administration. Let's just go with that. But then, again, unexpectedly, Kennedy got shot, so he is the president. And he wanted to continue on with the Kennedy legacy. He kind of renames this Great Society, and this is basically FDR's programs kind of renewed. Find areas of poverty and bring prosperity to those areas. There's nothing odd about that. It's just a continuation of Kennedy's policies. He also agreed with civil rights, and more about that later, but he also had to struggle with Vietnam, and there was a lot of unanswered questions about that. And again, I will dedicate a lot of time and effort to that later on. Medicare, this is the beginning of social medicine that we all understand today, and surprisingly, Nixon will also agree with this. Nixon is going to expand and support Medicaid, and Medicare and Medicaid, but that all came from the Johnson administration, and that is to say, give medical care to old people. That's what Medicare really does. Everybody sets aside a little bit of money, a little bit of taxpayer money is set aside on this, but then when you're in your retirement years, as an addition to Social Security, you can apply for Medicare, and old folks will get medical care. And so this is really a tremendous program, and it's worked for all these, 50, 60 years now. He also wants to expand on education benefits and continue on with the war on poverty. And these are both extensions of democratic policies that have been going on really since FDR. So this is just really an extension of that. And again, if you'll imagine, LBJ as a young man, he came up under the FDR, the New Deal. So he was very intimately familiar with these things. The policies that Truman had espoused in his administration. LBJ was in Congress at the time and wholeheartedly supported that. So you can kind of think of the Eisenhower administration as just sort of a hiccup, and then a return to Democratic presidents who have all this very progressive agenda. However, the downside to all of Great Society and education benefits and the war on poverty was, and make a good strong note on this, all of the money was sucked up by Vietnam. Vietnam sucked up all the money. In other words, without tremendous increases in taxation, we could not have fought the Vietnam War, which was escalating, and done all these social programs. So LBJ, he was genuinely upset that all of these programs to increase prosperity were just tripped up by this terrible war that he was in and could not find a way out of. It was just tremendously disappointing to him, and he said that publicly, and it's also in all of his writings. So again, going back to how we think of LBJ as a man, the Vietnam War just clouds it all up, because he kept on going for the war and going for the war and going for the war. But in our domestic, he wanted to continue on with this war on poverty and promote education and promote the Peace Corps and do all these positive things for civil rights. But so again, it's a decade of chaos, and I can't paint a more clear picture of chaos than the administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson. So with all that in mind, the next few slides now, you might as well go get yourself some popcorn, get something to drink, and sharpen your pencils. Because the next couple of slides for sure, they're nothing but verbiage, and it's the highlights to the civil rights. Then we'll have a little bit of an interregnum there, and we'll talk about Vietnam through maps and images, and then we'll talk about a Vietnam timeline. So the next 5 or 6 slides, pitch your tents and get ready to camp out, because these are going to take forever to get through. All right, but I just can't think of a better way to get through civil rights and Vietnam, which are these gigantic issues. So these are the things that really dominated the Johnson administration.